everyone. Welcome to the STOA. Today, the session is the theory of neural annealing. And we have someone from the Qualia Research Institute who will be introduced by Duncan Horst in a moment. Duncan was a past guest of the STOA last summer. You might recall him, and he's back and for this session and perhaps more sessions, interviewing really cool people on a variety of different topics. So I'll take in Duncan in a moment to introduce today's guest. And how today will work is there'll be a presentation for about 20-30 minutes. Duncan, today's guest, will have a conversation, and then we'll do a Q&A, brief Q&A. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'll call on you. Unmute yourself. You can ask your question. If you want to ask a question anonymously, because you might want to share some personal information, just message me privately, and I can read your question on your behalf. And we're here officially for 60 minutes, but if there's some sort of aliveness in the room, we can go a little bit longer, perhaps 75 minutes. So that being said, I will take in Duncan now. Duncan, welcome back to the STOA, my friend. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, my friend. I'm really looking forward to this session. Just start by introducing Andrés. Andrés Gómez Emilsson is the co-director of research for the Qualia Research Institute. He had a master's in comp psychology from Stanford and background in graph theory, statistics, and effective science. He's a transhumanist based out in Silicon Valley and worked there for a couple of years before jumping off to co-found the Qualia Research Institute. The Qualia Research Institute is quite interesting, I find, in that it bridges a lot of topics that are of strong interest to philosophers, to neuroscientists, to those looking to truly build a better world from first principles. And Andrés will describe this far better than I, but what really drew me to the Qualia Research Institute and wanted to have him on and propose this to Peter as a topic was that the Qualia Research Institute is bridging meditation, psychedelics, neuroscience to help understand how to craft a better world by annealing, by deliberately changing the brain, by updating it in order to better reflect reality, and by essentially attempting to engineer bliss states, not just for the self, but for others, and to do so in a repeatable and sustainable manner. So it's using science to reach some of the heights of philosophy, of meditative practice, and some of the bliss states that are found in the jhanas, the advanced states of meditation, as well as certain psychedelic heights, as well as artistic domains. And you know, for a Stoic who desires not to be attached by pain or pleasure, craving or aversion, it's really fascinating to see the link and the theories of getting from here to there, of what that does to the brain and how it rewires the brain to have an effect on reality. Anyway, I'd love to hand it over to Andrés to speak a little bit more about the Qualia Research Institute and his role in it, and to take you through a brief presentation, actually a mid-length presentation, before we open the floor for some more discussion and questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, I'm going to share the screen. And of course, yeah, can people see this? Perfectly. Perfect. Excellent. So thank you so much. And yeah, so I'm going to go over kind of a theory of neural annealing. There's quite a few slides, but I'll go through them pretty quickly. I just think it's good to put them up there so that people can, you know, later on the YouTube video, just pause and maybe read them and contemplate it. So first of all, kind of like a note on psychedelic epistemology, which is like, okay, why would you care to listen to me in particular about this topic? And I would say that, you know, in a sense, I've been very, very fortunate because, you know, since roughly 2015 or so, I've been, yeah, writing about exotic states of consciousness and trying to formalize them and, you know, finding patterns in them. And since then, I've just gotten so much like interesting correspondence from like, pretty smart people. And over time, I would say that, it's sort of like an emergent think tank model has has kind of a reason where, if you were to use, like each of these architectures in order to process information, imagine kind of like a neural network, most likely the think tank model would probably be, a more efficient information processing system. So I would say that, it's just kind of for whatever luck of fate, I've just happened to be pretty close to like a bunch of people where like a lot of really good feedback can happen for models of how states of consciousness work. So getting into it, neural annealing, Mike Johnson, my co-founder of Quality Research, wrote an essay in 2019. I highly recommend it, where basically he goes over neural annealing as kind of like drawing from a metaphor with metallurgy, where after you use a metal too much, kind of like in day-to-day practice, it becomes cold worked, like tiny imperfections and indentations in the metal basically kind of disrupt the structure of the lattice, and that can make it like brittle and hard to work with. But if you heat it up and then cool it down slowly, the actual atomic lattice can rearrange and become much more symmetrical. And what's really magical about this is that in a sense you are creating a ton of order. You're like actually getting this very beautiful symmetrical lattice by applying disorder, which is kind of paradoxical. I mean, in the end, the second law of thermodynamics still applies. I mean, obviously, you're still increasing the disorder in the universe, but locally, as a trick, you're reducing the disorder in this particular bucket of reality. And, as a general kind of idea, it's pretty intriguing. Like self-organizing systems can, in a sense, surf the tides of uncertainty by, in a sense, like becoming more ordered by taking advantage of disorder in an intelligent way. And kind of the North Star here, like the thing that we eventually want to be able to share with the world, and therapists and, for meditation practice, is a sort of like neural annealing, manual, like basically something that tackles every core subproblem of how annealing may happen in a nervous system and help you optimize it. So these would contain like strategies such as like, how to do energy raising, and a lot of meditation techniques. We can think of them we can analyze them through the lens of like, in what way this is kind of like raising energy, in what ways it is, in a sense, dampening energy, or, techniques for like shifting energy from one modality to another. Just as an example, on like a psychedelic trip, in sometimes like most of the intensity of the experience may be concentrated in, for example, very bright colors, like that can happen. But also, if by chance or deliberately, that energy can perhaps like shift to, for example, very strong body sensations. So in a sense, like there's this whole sub problem of how do you kind of like handle and manage and transform energy from one modality to another. And like I would claim a lot of meditation is actually kind of developing that ability. So there's, all of these like sub problems, and a big picture would basically contain detailed answers to all of them. But to kind of like, paint the the overview here, neural annealing is extremely connected to basically reduced, beliefs under psychedelics, a very recent work by Carhart Harris and Carl Friston, where basically they analyze what's going on in the brain through the lens of basically the free energy principle, which analyzes dynamical systems as probabilistic graphical models, basically saying that for a dynamical system to survive over time, it has to be, in a sense, capable of like modeling its environment well enough so that it can maintain its own homeostasis. And, as a consequence, there's kind of this like cost of, how complicated the model is. So in the sense, like for this reason, the thing that ends up being maximized is this equilibrium between like the accuracy of the model and minus the complexity. So you need kind of like a balance of the two. And what they might say is that on psychedelics, in a sense, you become sensitized to low-level prediction errors that you used to perhaps kind of like clamp down with your priors, and like psychedelics allow them to basically bypass kind of like your priors, and they actually bring it up in the context of simulated annealing. Now, what's interesting here is that annealing in this framework is happening in a probabilistic graphical model rather than like physical annealing. And in a second, I'll explain what the connection between the two would be. I think like as an important caveat is that in the model of rebus, basically they talk about like, reducing, the sensitivity of the high level priors, and how in a sense like strong those priors are. And but the thing is that, in psychedelics you also see things like, deep dream phenomenology, where it seems like with weaker evidence you kind of like arrive at, high level interpretations like, oh, is this an eye or is this a dog? So clearly reduced beliefs is not all that is happening, right? Like there's actually something much more detailed and interesting, where like in some contexts maybe it seems to enhance beliefs, in some others it seems to reduce, the intensity of beliefs. So what is really going on here? And I'll explain that. I think like neural annealing, in a sense, is like a more comprehensive model that also takes into account these issues. Importantly, the way in which we think of this is in an actual literal physical implementation sense. And of course, like information processing systems can be analyzed, at the algorithmic level, but also at the physical level. And importantly, there's a lot of like recent research in neuroscience that identifies brain states as the weighted sum of harmonic resonant modes, basically all the ways in which the brain can, waves of energy can propagate within the brain and generate standing waves. And basically all of the ways in which that can happen, there's a discrete number of them. And there's like some fascinating methods to, estimate what is the weighted sum of a particular brain state. And what has been found, by and large, is that a signature of intensified consciousness is actually more energy in all of these harmonics. Like if you add up the energy of all the harmonics on more intense, psychedelic experiences, it's just higher. Importantly too, on psychedelics in particular, you have this pattern where the high frequency harmonics increase significantly in their energy, whereas the low frequency harmonics may even go down. And in our interpretation, what is going on here is that the low frequency harmonics actually encode the priors. Basically, they're kind of like these pretty encompassing waves that actually, propagate information throughout your nervous system. Whereas, high frequency harmonics are much more like detailed and semantic, and maybe like painting kind of the corners of your world simulation rather than like the broad outlines, so to speak. So when you lose the, intensity of the low frequency harmonics, that is in a sense kind of reducing the strength of the priors. And that allows, kind of a chaotic anarchic state of many high frequency harmonics basically trying to compete for existence. And that process can essentially have information processing advantages. Just to kind of develop an intuition. I mean, what's fascinating with this kind of work is that there's a finite number of ways in which your brain can resonate. And it's very intriguing that, we may be able to empirically actually tell, what is the weighted sum for a particular state. Basically, just going over, it's very important that, because the low frequency harmonics, their amplitude goes down, that suggests that, like a very important component of a psychedelic experience is actually grounding, that you require some kind of like makeshift grounding technology to kind of like make up for the absence of the low frequency harmonics. And I think like a lot of kind of like shamanic practices, or for example, like beating drums, or, various breathing techniques of the sort, can essentially play that role. I mean, they kind of like are these makeshift, physiological low frequency like oscillations that in a sense ground experience, and can facilitate annealing towards those states in particular. I definitely want to mention that, within our whole paradigm, there is this fascinating duality between the shape of your world simulation, which is basically kind of the interference pattern between the harmonics in your brain, and the overall vibe of the state. And like, there's I don't know, I've seen a recent Less Wrong article about, whether like vibing is a real thing or not. And I would definitely say that vibing is a real thing, and depressed people don't vibe, just for example, as a general rule. And I mean, I think it has to do with basically when your world simulation is, fairly energetically clean, the waves of energy can propagate actually without a viscosity and interruptions or blockages. Essentially, you get an aggregate vibe of the entirety of your experience. And that has a particular hedonic tone. And the hedonic tone, we think, actually depends on the symmetries of the things that are contained within your world simulation, which is why if you're not depressed and you look at a picture like this, you can experience a kind of a sense of awe. And from our point of view, that's because, yeah, the actual internal representations in your consciousness here are made out of like, yeah, these symmetrical building blocks that are harmonized with one another. And for that reason, in a sense, the overall resulting, corresponding vibe of this picture for you will be a high hedonic tone, high valence, basically a pleasant, it will have a pleasant tone. When we say something like, hey, somebody has like a negative vibe or something, like in this picture, actually in the world simulation, you're literally representing, some aspects of that person with, for example, more spiky components would actually give rise to more dissonant quality. But this picture also kind of highlights that, if you start out with kind of like very, dissonant configurations, in a sense, like annealing might actually be very, very beneficial at that point, because it may allow you to smooth out those internal representations. So yeah, I guess I'm just putting this picture in as kind of a, who would benefit from neural annealing? Well, if somebody has like very, very spiky internal representations, as a manner of speaking, basically, internal representations that really disrupt the a pleasant vibe of your experience, essentially. And yeah, basically correlated with neuroticism and yeah, other unpleasant states of consciousness. Whereas, yeah, I mean, internal representations we essentially predict are high valence would be much more like this, something that actually, is kind of like a simple weighted sum of resonant modes. Now, okay, so to the nitty-gritty of annealing in a sense. So you have your, what we call world sheet. Basically, this is the depth map of the world simulation that you're experiencing. And this would be kind of like normal world sheet. I mean, for the most part, this is the kind of depth map that we tend to experience. And this is kind of like an example of world sheet plus texture. If you guys know Magic Eye, if you have practice with this, you will probably be able to see a lobster hidden in this shape. But the really cool thing is that this lobster essentially is the depth map of this picture. And then, but the entirety of the visual representation has the same texture. It's the same texture. The only thing that's different is the depth map. And in a sense, that's kind of a very clean representation of what I mean by the world sheet. That like, here's kind of a world sheet painted with a particular texture. So the world sheet again is the depth map. And here's what happens. Like, in a sense, there's this quantity, this energy parameter for how excited your world sheet is. As a general rule, the more excited your world sheet is, the more confused you're going to be. Basically, the more competing interpretations will be possible. And importantly, there is ways in which the world sheet can lower its energy. So remember, for example, in a soap bubble, why does it always become spherical? Well, because that's its lowest energy configuration. In a sense, any other configuration is higher energy, which keeps it moving. And as it moves, it radiates its energy out. So essentially, the only shape that ends up having no more energy to radiate is basically just a perfectly symmetrical shape. So when you have an excited world sheet, you took some psychedelic and you have this crazy wobbling thing going on in your visual field and sensory field more generally. We postulate that there's energy sinks that can, in a sense, suck out the energy out of it and crystallize around those energy sinks. And there's essentially two kinds of energy sinks. There is essentially just the energy sinks that are based on symmetry. So that's like a very big category. And then we have what we call the Bayesian energy sinks, which is basically whatever you can expect, whatever makes sense will lower the energy of your world sheet. Now, in practice, if you take a strong psychedelic, there's so much energy that actually most of the things will be a hybrid between the two, which is kind of like this thing in the middle, which is maybe this mixture of, oh, this is like a highly complex, symmetrical arrangement of a boat. So it combines both, symmetries and semantic content as energy sinks. And yeah, no surprise, that is essentially the sort of thing that you will tend to experience if you have a highly energized world sheet. Yeah, okay, maybe you guys can see this. this is the sort of kind of like, low energy configuration of a visual field on a psychedelic, which is, basically a repeating wallpaper symmetry group transforming along one of its symmetry elements. And basically the experience tends to become full of things like this when you're in a, basically highly energized state of consciousness, because these are precisely the sort of things that trap the energy and function as sinks. This is just as a representation of some pictures by the Grays, Alex Gray and Alison Gray, which all of them are hybrid, right? Like they have like a component of semantic content, but also a bunch of symmetries. And like you will see that, most hyper-excited states of consciousness have kind of that quality, that they blend the two. And importantly, if you want to, in a sense, I would claim, derive the most therapeutic benefits of kind of these states of consciousness, to a large extent, I would actually argue to move away from semantic content and actually focus much more on just the symmetrical energy sinks. And the reason is that basically they contain less information, and as such, they will generally be like stronger high valence attractors. And hopefully this will make sense in a second. So just to kind of like lay out the full theory, like in what way this is connected with, rebus, reduced beliefs under psychedelics. Well, neural annealing is the implementation level analysis of what is going on. So what we postulate is that your nervous system is a resonance network, first of all. And second, that the thing that it's trying to do is minimizing its own dissonance. And basically it's a complex network. So there's like a lot of ways in which the connections in the network can give rise to dissonant states. And it's like constantly, finding ways in which it's dissonant and moving away from them. And there's basically two things that generate dissonance in your neural network in general. You could have like, disorders of consciousness, all sorts of things, or chronic pain. But in general, like if your nervous system is functioning well, prediction errors are going to be experienced as dissonant, because that's kind of different layers of the hierarchy are not synced up. Basically what one layer is predicting, if it's not correct, that is going to be perceived as a dissonance event, which is unpleasant. So that motivates us to basically create like accurate models of the world. And second, there's an inherent model complexity cost, that basically when you have like a very complex model of the world, that basically creates a lot of inner tension. Like the resonance network is too complicated, that has an inherent dissonance quality. Whereas, in the probabilistic graphical models, world, the thing that you're trying to minimize is, basically this thing that's the variational free energy, which is, basically a computational construct. And we postulate a duality here, that in a sense, whenever you solve a problem in one domain, you're in a sense solving a problem in the other domain. So it's kind of similar to kind of a Fourier transform in a sense. You can do something in one domain and it will translate into the other. So for example, if you learn to relax very deeply, that will allow you to, in a sense, accept prediction errors more easily and update your nervous system. So in a sense, this whole idea of stoicism and equanimity actually makes a lot of sense, that developing that and embodying that actually then allows you to, in a sense, face reality at the intellectual level as well. So there's kind of this correspondence with like how much you can actually relax your internal models and how much you can relax your muscles. That there is a deep, deep, deep correspondence between these. And as Alan Watts, I think, said, the ego is kind of a pattern of muscular tension we identify with. So yes, I mean, actually, a lot of kind of like ego-less states of consciousness have to do with basically a kind of very deep network relaxation. The way the free energy principle, basically works out here is that, the model complexity causes dissonance. Failed predictions cause dissonance. So minimizing dissonance may minimize the free energy as a side effect. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Now, I'll just walk you through basically the difference between 5-MeO-DMT and DMT in this framework, just to kind of like ground the discussion. And in a sense, we postulate that the core difference is that on DMT, basically you have competing patterns of coherence is the thing that tends to arise, whereas on 5-MeO-DMT, you get global coherence. And in a sense, those are give rise to very different types of annealing. So, in DMT, you have kind of like these competing clusters within the hierarchy. Sometimes some of those clusters may be, a texture and a color and a body sensation kind of come together to form a kind of like little crater, like a little qualia crater, as we call them. But sometimes it could be something higher up in the layer, higher in the layers of the hierarchy, such as, for example, a representation of an entity, which can also perhaps like recruit some low-level sensations and kind of embody a whole personality. And there would be kind of like another competing cluster of coherence. And for that reason, DMT is much more of a kind of ecosystem. You're giving rise to evolutionary, selection pressures for patterns of coherence, and they're competing for your attention. And like the end result is not necessarily very friendly, because very strong competition for survival, so the DMT entities that actually survive in your, neuronal environment may actually be unfriendly. They may have like kind of very unfriendly ways of, competing for your attention. Whereas, basically 5-MeO DMT, in contrast, we postulate basically makes the brain so interconnected that actually the patterns that are really good at surviving there tend to be of global coherence. And as a consequence, basically all of the internal boundaries get dissolved, and that makes it impossible for you to represent the distinction between self and other, among many other things. Importantly, though, you can enter a particularly unpleasant state of consciousness with 5-MeO DMT, which is when two competing clusters of coherence arise, which would be kind of a failure mode of this type of annealing. And like we definitely need to figure out ways of avoiding that, because it's a very bad trip, and like we definitely don't want to add that to the universe, obviously. Now, importantly, right, like the more you kind of like anneal, whether it's like psychedelics or meditation. In meditation, again, there are many techniques for raising energy. And, if you do something like a casino retreat, as documented by Daniel Ingram and many others, over the course of 1 week, you can literally energize your visual field to the point that it's, basically at a level of a kind of DMT intensity of energy and emergent effects. And essentially by doing this over and over and biasing the recrystallization process towards basically the lower energy, highly symmetrical configurations, over time, you basically get rid of samskaras and basically imperfections and distortions in your nervous system, because you're kind of recovering the native harmonics. And there's something very, I think, like true and deep about, Buddha saying something like, like the natural state of being is perfectly blissful. That in a sense, if you don't have the distortions that usually plague our nervous system, just the natural superposition of our main harmonics is a very pleasant, euphoric, perfectly peaceful state of consciousness. And essentially, we claim that the more you're annealing these particular symmetrical states of consciousness, the more, in a sense, you're purifying your nervous system and achieving that pretty natural state. And I would symbolize that with kind of like the picture on the right, which is when all of the harmonics of your nervous system are in harmony and basically can pull energy together and they cooperate with one another. And that's kind of you could call it a no self, hyper cooperative state of consciousness, perhaps more towards the kind of like soul or pure consciousness versus, a kind of ego or replicator type of dynamic. I'll mention too that even though I think like in terms of like euphoria and sense of well-being, kind of like annealing towards these hypersymmetrical states is basically the way to go. At the level of epistemology, however, there is a little bit of a, dysfunctional failure modes. And I think that basically if you go way too much towards kind of the hypersymmetrical states of consciousness, you tend to anneal also very simple beliefs, and you tend to assign extremely, high accuracy to those beliefs. And you end up, in a sense, advocating for those beliefs as if they were the solution to everything, which is a failure mode that we see with people who do a lot of 5-MeO DMT or meditate a lot without a grounding, which is that they might say something like, hey, we are all God, or everything is love. And that's all that you need, and if we all know that, then there's going to be world peace or, something like that. And I don't think that's true. I mean, I think that's a piece of the puzzle, but it's by no means the whole story. It's reality is pretty detailed, and that's throwing out a bunch of data. It's just kind of being negligent about prediction errors in a way. But of course, there's the opposite extreme. If you take too much DMT because of the complexification of experience, through this Darwinian process of competing patterns of coherence, you end up doing too much overfitting. In a sense, you create extremely complex models of reality. And I think like that's also wrong. That's also, you're going in the long term going to get more prediction errors because, most likely this is actually not a simulation. The Greys and the Russians are probably not plotting, and Ra and Thor are probably part of our imagination. So if you're modeling this incorrectly, yes, in a sense that's a different failure mode. In the very very big picture, and I think I'm almost done. So in the very big picture, we want basically a way of navigating the state space of consciousness for wholesome annealing that doesn't impair our epistemology, but also heals our nervous system. And I think we can draw from meditation practices as well as early pioneers for kind of ideas for how to do this. I mean, I would say equanimity all the way. I'm very much on board with the idea of maximizing equanimity for doing then meditation or psychedelic trips. Then there's a big difference between just quote unquote letting go at an intellectual level versus doing somatic practices of letting go for an entire month before a psychedelic trip. And I think the second one is just way more powerful. It's exponentially more powerful if you're actually being investing hours into developing equanimity, so that then when you're exposed to kind of the fire, the intense energy of something like a psychedelic state, you can actually harness it in a way that doesn't burn you, because with equanimity, you can basically hold all of that energy without being flinching away from it. And I think that's very important. I also think that loving kindness as a really powerful, in a sense, entrained metronome that generates harmonious waves of energy. And again, this sounds so woo, but phenomenologically, I think it's true that if you've been developing a lot of loving kindness and you take a psychedelic trip, in a sense, you will encounter that beautiful metronome that you've been cultivating, and it's going to be essentially sending waves of love throughout your nervous system, and that will have a healing power to such an extent that I actually expect the studies in the future will, in a sense, quantify, what is the rate at which the waves of love, of loving kindness are healing your internal representations, that would actually correspond with a physical quantity. It's going to be measurable. And yeah, I think to conclude, I would also point you to The Psychedelic Experience, written by Timothy Leary, which is, it's a completely batshit insane piece of work. But if you analyze it from the point of view of neural annealing, actually, they're pretty pioneering in the sense that a lot of what they're saying is really kind of techniques to stay in the low entropy, low information state, super high energy configuration for as long as possible, which is what they call the first bardo. They say things like, remember the unity of all living beings, remember the bliss of the clear light, et cetera, et cetera. All of these are basically instructions to help your attention focus on these excited, high energy, high valence, low information, high symmetry states of consciousness. Well, that's what we think. That would be our interpretation. And I'll, this slide, if anybody wants to pause the video and read it later on. And the final one is very high quality annealing targets would be, the Brahma Viharas, the 4 divine abodes, and the 7 factors of awakening. So practicing all of these things before a psychedelic trip, or basically accessing high energy states of consciousness, it's all great. All of these are good. I endorse them 100%. Go forth and practice these beautiful states of consciousness. And that's about it. So please, if you're inspired by these, you want to see this in the world, see it published in peer-reviewed papers and studies and get data. If you're interested in getting, basically funding for that purpose, please cite our work and cite Stephen Lehar. A lot of these ideas are also based on his research. So thank you so much, and happy annealings.
Thank you very much, Andres. Before I give it over for larger questions, I just have 2 questions for you, kind of multi-part, but just for people who are just starting on their annealing journey. I've seen a lot of the failure modes of both sides of it, the underfooting and the overfitting. So typically people who are more grounded and stable in their reality don't have the will to go above, beyond, and seek out these transcendental states, let alone safely transmit them to others. And then the people who are most driven to seek out these transcendental states tend to be the least grounded people in my awareness, and can often go scattershot after a few months or a few years of fruitful practice, which makes that even more painful because they were onto something. So my first question for you is, what is the proper order? Like how does one safely massage themselves into an annealing journey, and what is a general overview of the states and stages to attempt?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, the answer is I don't know. I think this analytic framework can potentially be very helpful. And I mean, I would definitely point people towards things such as the stages of insight, as described in Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. And I would argue, yes, you can reading through them. A lot of it makes sense from the point of view of undergoing different annealing cycles. And so, I mean, definitely kind of the standard maps of stream entry and the stages of insight and all of that. I think yeah, it's very, very helpful. And ultimately, I think they're pointing at basically a kind of a pre-theoretical or pre-Galilean kind of a neural annealing science. I would definitely say that I do recommend thinking of it kind of from a material science point of view, which is there's going to be a lot of very counterintuitive things, just as in material science is oh gosh, and it turns out that adding a little bit of carbon, at this temperature in this particular cycle makes the resulting metal way more flexible, and things like that. It will probably turn out that within certain parameter ranges, doing counterintuitive things now you have to take a cold shower may accelerate the annealing cycles tenfold or something like that. The answer is yeah, we don't know, but I'm extremely open to basically just gathering as much data as possible for interesting techniques like that.
Sure. And last question that I have is, in the theory of neural annealing, you talk about a few different modes of annealing and then things that you can anneal to. So meditation was the most recommended way because it didn't use an external stimuli to overexcite the neurons, but then psychedelics were also mentioned. Music included everything involving rhythm, so dancing, breath work, etc., was also recommended. And then you can anneal to not only a state, but also a culture, a social group, or even the theory of neural annealing itself, which I assume to some extent you have annealed to and are building your consciousness around. I'm just curious, what states, what modes of annealing accomplish what? Which are the best fit modes of annealing that you would actually prescribe to achieve a desired effect? And how do you deliberately choose a system, be it stoicism, be it the theory of neural annealing itself, to fix on and anneal to while avoiding harm or undue limitation?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think it really depends on the person and basically their particular social environment and the way in which they may be related in harmony with their social environment, and their life purpose. I think it really depends on the person. I guess I'm very much a fan of kind of thinking of it from a point of view of Keegan level 5, which is I don't want to prescribe a particular worldview and think more okay, what is going to fit best to this individual? And yeah, I mean, I think in the end, it's going to be an empirical question. But I can say something, which is that I do think that for particular issues, deep traumas, for example, there is a sense in which you require a minimum of energy in order to essentially melt the structures that are underlying the dissonance quality of that configuration. And anything below certain energy thresholds will just not work. So I do think that, for example, MDMA therapy can address some very, very deep dissonances that other things won't reach, simply because they don't get to that level of harmonious energy, and that might be just kind of a strict requirement for some things. I mean, maybe perhaps also kind of fundamental suffering like might require like a lot of annealing cycles to ultimately uproot it, and that also fundamentally may require a threshold of energy, and like below that like it just doesn't work. But to get like interesting like socially useful annealing effects, you don't actually need that much energy. And I would say something like I mean, I'm very interested in kind of like how do you maximize kind of like holistic and wholesome festivals, things like Burning Man or Ephemeral. They're like, you can also look at them from the point of view of neural annealing, because you over the course of like an entire week, in a sense, like the entire environment is set up in order to constantly surprise you, and constant surprises basically are like energy raising. So over the course of kind of like 1 week, you're building up this momentum, similar to meditation, like how you would be building up kind of like concentration momentum over a whole week. On a festival, you're building up a surprise momentum over an entire week. And that, in a sense, can, basically re-annealing you something like optimism about the world or optimism about humanity. And like, you don't need to go super high in the energy level to get that effect. Like, even if you don't take drugs at Burning Man, you will get an effect like that. And optimizing things like that is also something I'm very interested in.
Great. I'd like to turn it over to Peter for some of the group's questions in chat.
Great. Thank you, Duncan. And thank you for introducing me to this stuff. This is amazing. Thank you for that presentation, Andreas. This is awesome. So we have a lot of good questions. I'm going to take an Anjan first and then Evan. So Anjan, if you can ask your question.
Hey, Andrés. It's cool to see you in person. Dude, yeah, I read your theory a while back, and then to see it in person now, just every time I'm reminded, you're able to explain so many more things that otherwise are just like a shrug and dude, it works. Like, that gets me so fucking excited. Like, holy shit, random meditation thing, random thing here, and neural annealing is somehow able to connect it all. So I'm incredibly convinced every time I come across your work. Somehow I must be a bad messenger of your ideas, because when I try to discuss it with my smart neuroscience friends, they think you guys are nuts. So I'm just wondering if you could like steel man, or as Peter would say, titanium man, people who think you're nuts would be my first question.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, well, I made a video yesterday in my YouTube channel about like digital sentience, and like whether digital computers will ever be conscious, because at QRI we think that they can't be conscious, and like that as a signal usually makes people basically downgrade how smart they think we are. It's like, oh, they probably are making one of those like dumb mistakes that like people make when they think that computers can't be conscious. And I think, I mean, a lot of it ultimately stems from kind of the fact that we don't buy into computational theory of mind. And that alone, because it is the smart person view, it is like literally like all the smart people around for good reasons believe in computational theory of consciousness, then yeah, I mean, it makes sense that people with their high level prior of like, okay, what kind of work are we doing, definitely would downgrade us. But in the end, I think like we can make a really compelling case. It's just basically it takes a little bit of time to understand it. I mean, I could definitely titanium man some computational theory of consciousness, and within it, things like neural annealing seem crazy, because it seems like you're basically taking at face value feelings and sensations, which in that worldview, basically feelings and sensations are just kind of like computational tokens. They're just like pieces of information that maybe represent your internal attention dynamics, but you shouldn't be paying attention to like energetic feelings or something like that. Like that's kind of like beyond the pale of like things that you should be paying attention to. Like all of those are, lead to delusions. They have nothing to do with reality. Whereas like, no, actually, I think physically, as we become better at neuroimaging, we will effectively realize that when you feel a wave of energy traveling through your body, that actually corresponds to particular waves of energy traveling through your somatosensory cortex. And like that the dynamics of that will map onto the physical dynamics of like energetic feelings. And more so as we conduct studies in these, I essentially anticipate that like talent when it comes to like managing the energy flows in your nervous system will map onto like faster meditation progress. And like that as an empirical data point will, in a sense, I think like fortify the claim that actually we should be paying attention to these phenomena. But yeah, I mean, I guess to summarize, I would say most of the titanium manning of mainstream neuroscience would be on kind of clamping down like why computational theory of consciousness is true and like why any other theory doesn't make sense. And I think we can do that. It just takes time.
Any follow-up?
If you don't mind me sneaking in a quick follow-up, I don't really know what I'm asking, but I like animals. So like a Porsche spider or an octopus or these kind of other architectures of intelligence, do you know if neural annealing applies just as well to them, or is there particular inflection points that maybe are specific to our architecture?
Yeah, so a couple things here. So, I mean, first of all, like brain harmonics are a pretty natural thing to do or to use for computation because you get them for free. In a sense, like they're there, like there is kind of like what emerges, you know, at the physical level, just from having like a neural architecture. So essentially we expect like the nervous systems of every animal that has a central nervous system will basically be utilizing the harmonics of the system for computation and basically for navigation. And the reason is because, you know, they're there. They're like a very cheap, energetically simple way of basically harnessing the power of a nervous system. So that's one. And, you know, second, we also think that, you know, the symmetry theory of valence is universal, that it's basically the nature of consciousness is such that basically states of consciousness with this harmonious vibe are actually what feels good. And finally, you know, more symmetrical states of consciousness are lower energy in general, as well as kind of the similar to basically a crystal configuration is like the energy minimizing configuration. So based on those three, you know, pieces of information, I very much expect that, you know, in octopus, actually annealing is going on as well. And that, you know, achieving these kind of annealed states is the way in which an octopus has a pleasant experience. And I don't know, it's very surprising that, for example, you can give like MDMA to octopi and like they will react in an MDMA type of way, which, yeah, I mean, it's very suggestive that probably MDMA type annealing is going on with octopi as well.
Maybe even aliens. Yeah. Peter, don't attack me too bad, but I gotta ask this question. I watched a video of lemurs biting, like, I forget what they are, like kind of poisonous centipedes or something like that. And then they would rub it all over themselves and basically get drunk off of this. And so I'm wondering, like, from a neural annealing perspective, obviously getting drunk or disassociated is not just a human thing if lemurs are doing it as well. Do you have any explanation for why it's pleasurable to get drunk, or why that instinct exists?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like, as a very, very big picture, different drugs enable different types of flow. And basically the type of flow that it gets enabled through a particular drug basically is like waves of energy that you can harness for like euphoric effects. So, I mean, yeah, and as a concrete example, like 5-MeO DMT seems to basically create a kind of flow that is completely orthogonal to like energy blockages in our system otherwise, which basically is kind of like one of the reasons why it can maximize euphoria, because you get this perfectly clean traveling of basically energy, which highlights the native harmonics of your nervous system with like no semantic content. So that's kind of like the I guess most extreme version of these. But like, yeah, even something like getting drunk, you can think of it as like particular low frequency harmonious waves become activated, and like we enjoy that. I mean, when somebody says like I drink because of the buzz, like why would the buzz matter? We think like actually the buzz has a hedonic quality, and that hedonic quality corresponds to the symmetries of this flow that it enables. And yeah, that's the reason why we enjoy that type of thing.
Awesome. Thank you, Anjan. So we'll probably go about 10-15 minutes after the hour. We had a lot of good questions. I'll take an Evan next.
All right. So first of all, I just want to say I love your work. This is like really happy and exciting for me because I did this self-experiment where I did 5-MeO DMT every day for 3 months. And this was a long time ago, but I came up with a much less mathematically rigorous concept to explain what had happened to me that has very deep resonance with neural annealing. So I really appreciate the work you guys are doing, putting out this theory, because I think it's awesome. Now, I'm actually interested in a practical application of this and to get your take on that. So there's a phenomenology that a lot of meditators have noticed, whereby if you do N hours of meditation, it seems to be much more effective in terms of creating a persistent positive psychological change if these N hours are all in a row, say in the context of a intensive retreat. So if I'm going to do 10 hours of meditation, if I do that 10 hours in a row versus if I do 10 days of 1 hour a day, right? And obviously you can only max out, well, you got to sleep at some point, but then stacking it as close as possible, right? So this to me suggests that if we take the neural annealing perspective, that this would actually have strong impact for proper guidance for meditators, meaning that they should probably focus more on having access to retreat spaces and time than they should on cultivating a specific like hour-long daily practice. So I'm wondering if you agree if that is a consequence of the neural annealing perspective, and if so, if you have other thoughts sort of in that vague area.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and that's so awesome. I might need to invite you to our phenomenology clubs so that we can interview you. Actually, we've interviewed like one person who did 5-MeO-DMT every day for 6 months, and but you know, you'll be another important data point here. So yeah, okay. So on to your question. I mean, I think I mean, absolutely, when it comes to like as I mentioned, like achieving certain types of transformations require a threshold energy range. And I think like, yeah, basically stacking like as many hours of meditation as possible will kind of like safely and slowly build up to that level of energy. And yeah, I mean, I very much like, a lot of people get hung up on, for example, the question of, sorry, this seems like a tangent, but it's, so they hung up on, for example, like, is like LSD or psilocybin, like are the visuals like fundamentally different or something like that? And like I think at some level of energy, like most of the things that you experience are actually just like almost like inherent to just like very high energy levels. That like if you do a casino retreat like for 2 weeks, the trippy stuff that you will see will be mushroom-like stuff. Like you don't actually need kind of the psilocybin, you know, or that particular neurotransmitter system is kind of like just phenomena that happen because of like maxing out on the energy of your visual field. So for fundamental transformations, I do think like very high energy levels are probably necessary, but for integration, that's a different game. And I do think something like, you know, 1 hour a day in order to translate basically kind of these like more harmonized low entropy mind states to everyday life is pretty essential. So like, I think, yes, like some optimization will probably go towards like stacking a bunch of those hours, but some of the optimization will also go to like spreading them out intelligently. And I'm not sure what the perfect balance is, but I feel like there's probably an equation we can figure out for that.
Any follow-up, Evan?
Yeah, quick follow-up on that. So I appreciate the clarification of your position regarding, say, the different, you know, you don't necessarily need psilocybin to get psilocybin-like visuals, that whole line of thought. So I'm curious, though, it seems that an implication here is that for certain types of change, so changing patterns that are ingrained at a deep enough level, so the things we might generally refer to in the broad category of trauma, right? That there may be such patterns that are resistant even to MDMA, because it seems incapable of reaching the same level of intensity as, say, 5-MeO-DMT, for example, right? Or even extremely high dose LSD. So would you say that it would be a very promising research area to explore high dose or extremely intense psychedelics, like, say, you know, 1,000 mics of LSD, or, you know, like 20 grams or 20 milligrams, I should say, of 5-MeO-DMT for extremely difficult trauma?
I think so. I think so. The big caveat I would add is that I mean, this is probably super controversial, especially on everywhere. I think no. Okay, but like I think a problem with psychedelics though is like on high doses, basically the parasympathetic system gets super strongly activated. So like, or I think it's so basically you like these intense kind of like adrenergic storms that you get on like intense psychedelics that are like very, very bad for like neural annealing. So like there comes a point where like if you take like 500 micrograms, like if 3 hours are like just like spent of like on like super strong anxiety, I think like that's actually you're just doing a disservice to your nervous system. So where it gets controversial is I actually think that probably combining high dose psychedelics with something like gabapentin or like phenibut or something like that. I'm not sure if like phenibut in specific, because I've also gotten some like negative reports of the combination, but it's essentially something that shuts down kind of the more kind of like fight or flight component of the intense experience, but maintains the high level of energy. I think that type of intervention would be very promising. And I would definitely caution against kind of too much romanticism on like, hey, like on a high dose psychedelic, you will always get what you need, not what you want. Because like, no, a lot of it is just interdimensional torture, being pretty honest, right? So yeah, no, but and an important model, like I'll just like share it quickly, is that I mean, like why, like oftentimes like, yeah, high doses might be necessary. So like a trauma, I mean, you can think of it as like a very, very strong, like ingrained pattern that generates dissonance, but like the particular pattern, like why it's so resilient, it's because it is a knot, basically is a knotted pattern of tension where each component is reinforcing the other components. And it's kind of like, you can bring up kind of concepts from dynamic systems here, in the sense like if you have a threshold number of interlocking tensions that reinforce each other, it may be the case that like every time you try to undo that tension, trying to undo the tension generates more tension that it releases. So like very ingrained patterns of trauma, if you ruminate over them, they just get stronger. Like that, they have like that tendency. So you do require a kind of like these very highly energized waves of love for you to actually get the outer edges of the knot to kind of like lessen and lessen and lessen. And yeah, it may take like hours to kind of like undo those knots. But in the end, yeah, I think like high energies might be necessary for some of them.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Evan. Tom, you had a question?
Sure. This is Tom from Toronto. I'm with Anjan, and everything that you say, Andrés, seems to make sense to me. But the terminology you use, energy, soul, harmonics, tension, knots, and waves of love, really clashes with current scientific paradigms, and most specifically the modular computational theory of mind. And what you talk about is very much in line with a metaphor that I like using, which is the neuronal orchestra, and viewing the brain as an emergent self-programming, dynamic, complex critical system. So my question is, how long do you think it'll take before the theories of mind that are congruent with neural annealing replace the prevailing modular computational theories of mind that, in my view, are just so whacked out? How long do you think it'll take?
Oh my goodness. I don't know, the snarky thing to say would be something like science advances one funeral at a time. No, but I mean, I think, I actually think like things advance pretty quickly nowadays. And we obviously have like a huge wave of like basically, younger academics who will be far more open about like phenomenology of altered states of consciousness, especially as the decriminalization movement, moves forward and MDMA becomes a respectable, therapeutic. Like, so I'll give it like 10 years or something like that. Of course, everything will be accelerated if we can actually, publish a empirical demonstration of the symmetry theory of valence. And I think like, I don't know, I'm very optimistic that it actually will be like a big kind of a Schelling point for kind of this change of paradigm. But I don't know, very hard to predict.
Any follow-up, Tom?
No, just to say, I think it's through forums like this, Rebel Wisdom and this channel Stoa, that these ideas will emerge in the public consciousness and replace the the weirdly sort of mechanistic Newtonian views of the way the world works that are still prevailing in the scientific community. So so keep it up, Peter.
Thank you, Tom. Katie, this might be the last question I will take in.
Hi, good to see you. I love this theory. I think it's incredibly powerful and generates a lot of like testable predictions about the brain. And I may be here inadvertently representing the modular computational perspective, but it's out there. And so I guess I'm, partially inhabiting it. And I'm just curious in terms of kind of grounding in the biological constraints of the brain. Where do you think the limits are in terms of, say, like coherence and annealing versus having a seizure? Is that like an extreme form of annealing? And what would you expect as a kind of biological trace left by a lot of annealing experiences? Like what would you expect to see in, say, a highly annealed brain versus a non-annealed brain?
Awesome. Yeah, excellent questions. And yeah, good to see you too. Let's see. I mean, first of all, highly annealed brain. One thing for sure is going to be like unrestricted energy flow will be like a general thing. So for example, yeah, basically a kind of like energy superconductivity. So like basically somebody who's like really annealed and like kind of liberated, so to speak. I'd expect that, and this is a completely testable prediction. So like, I expect that if that person is like in a good meditative state, that if you basically stimulate one part of the nervous system with a transcranial magnetic stimulation, then like those waves of energy will travel in a much more linear and uninterrupted way throughout the nervous system, as opposed to like getting bogged down through blockages or dissipating throughout, as like may happen. I'd expect that somebody with anhedonia, for example, the waves of energy would dissipate rather than just propagate in a coherent fashion. And I think, remind me the first question that you asked?
Basically, how do you think about biological constraints with respect to annealing? We have these brain networks that most of the time are segregated, and then there's evidence that they can kind of connect up, and those are peak experiences. And maybe over time, they're reconfiguring. But then also you have, with propagating waves in the brain, you can get seizures. And is that sort of a feature or a bug in your theory?
Yeah. No, excellent. So, okay, so in a sense, for context, we essentially think that actually a lot of the brain has evolved in order for us to not be able to wirehead easily. So like there's kind of like a lot of like gunk, like by design, that we evolved to have. And it takes like 20 years of meditation to kind of like debug all of that and actually have kind of like this very clean annealed state. So in a sense, like the fact that we don't get seizures all the time is kind of like part of the deal. I think like that's kind of an evolved thing. And in a sense, if there weren't these kind of like natural impediments to wireheading, like getting a seizure would be way easier. And importantly, seizures, there is evidence that like they do have, at least for a subset of people, like very, very heavy like hedonic components, like temporal lobe epilepsy. Dostoevsky famously saying he would trade like 10 years of his life for like a few moments of such bliss. And essentially like, the temporal lobe is very central, it would be kind of like a natural place in a sense to get like all of the brain to harmonize. But also, it would be a place where you could also perhaps like maximize dissonance. So like you may also get like, heaven and hell type of scenario. Importantly though, there is like an in JANA EEG research, they have found that there's also seizure-like activity, except that there's a slight difference, which is like seizures tend to happen kind of in the 6 hertz range, whereas, like I think 4 hertz range, whereas JANAs have like this very interesting signature where you have basically a harmonic structure with its fundamental frequency around like 6 hertz. And so it's kind of like a slight difference in frequency, but also it contains its own harmonics, whereas the seizures don't contain their own harmonics. So in a sense, like Janus, at least within this lens, can be understood as kind of euphoric, very well crafted seizures that are like, very healthy and harmonious, rather than like this like random occurrence that like, may also cause a bunch of dissonance and disruption.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. So we're going to close out here. We will have a post-session sense-making chat. Evan just posted the Zoom link there. So if anyone who wants to, there's a lot to unpack and talk about with this session, so you can jump on that link. But yeah, I'll just, this was an awesome session. This took me by surprise. So Duncan, thanks so much for putting this on the STOA's radar. And I'll just perhaps tag in Duncan and Andreas for any kind of closing thoughts that either of you like to give us here at the STOA.
I'll be quick and let Andres have the last word. I think that'd be some good icing on the cake. But I just think it's incredibly important from a sense-making capacity to have a hardwired structure that can integrate so many different components. It's something that we can actually relax and surrender to if done right. So I just wanted to thank you again, Andres, for devoting so much of your life, so much of your time, for continuing to do it, to allow a greater parasympathetic relaxation around these topics so new structures can crystallize.
Thank you. I think I'll just close by mentioning that yeah, no, I mean, I'm very thankful for the invitation, and it's been a lot of fun. In terms of yeah, basically maintaining a good homeostasis of energy, I do compel people to basically make sure to add like genuine novelty to your day, because basically maintaining kind of like that level of energy is what allows you to basically be able to vibe, and vibing is really important to avoid depression. So especially now as we are coming out of isolation, it's important that we all keep vibing. So thank you very much, everybody. Keep vibing, and I'll talk to you soon.
Awesome. That's a great way to end. So I'll make some announcements in a moment, but Andreas, thank you so much for coming to the STOA. We'd love to have you back, perhaps for a short series. And Duncan will be returning. He has a lot of cool people to introduce to the STOA, so I'm quite excited about his explorations here at the STOA. Just some upcoming events for some novelty. We got a really cool lineup at the STOA this week. Toshin Fogelman, he's coming into a weird meta, a 3-part series, meta loving kindness meditation that was mentioned today, and it's going to end in a loving meta dance party on Friday. So it's Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That's going to be really cool. And tonight, Ben Burgess, the logician of the left, that's what he likes to call himself, is coming in to talk about canceling comedians while the world burns. So that should be an interesting take on cancel culture phenomenon. So you can check out that all out at thestoa.ca. So that being said, Andreas, Duncan, everyone, thank you for coming to the STOA today.